Thank you, Megan, and everybody. It's good to see everybody again. I hope you all had a good holiday. Today, what I'd like to do is to go back to the report that we did for the Walton Family Foundation. As you remember, it's a two-part report. The first part was a policy landscape assessment, we called it, looking at barriers to housing affordability, both in terms of zoning, but also looking more broadly than that. When I presented it to you in December, and then the second phase two was our recommendations based on what we had seen. And I know that Megan and Wes have shared those reports with you, and you've had an opportunity to look at them. When we met in December, I gave you sort of a high-level overview, with the understanding that we would be doing this deep dive today. There are three parts of the report that I think are really worth spending some time on, both in terms of understanding and what we learned from them. We're going to talk about two of them today. One is the spatial analysis that we did of land use in the region, particularly in the four largest cities. And the other was some model pro formas that we developed, looking at whether it was economically feasible in terms of a bottom line for developers to include workforce housing in their developments. And the person who was the lead on both of those, spatial analysis and the model pro formas, was Jordan Howard, who is an economic development specialist at Smart Growth America on our economic development team. So I've asked Jordan today to really go back and do a deep dive on both of those, and to give you time to ask questions and to really understand what both the spatial analysis and the model pro formas tell us about barriers to housing affordability in the region. So I'm excited that Jordan is available today and will talk us through that. And then there'll be plenty of time for you to ask questions in terms of clarity and just really understanding it. And then after Jordan's presentation, we're going to spend a little time giving you an update on the topics that we've been discussing for the policy seminars that SGA will be working with ULI Northwest Arkansas starting in April. We took the ideas that you developed in your workshop and organized them around some topics that we thought were particularly important based on all the research we did. And we want to walk you through where we are with those topics, how we've organized some of the issues that you raised in those topics, and our initial thinking about some possible thought leaders that we might invite to join us for those seminars to provide some additional knowledge and expertise. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next hour, and feel free at any time to raise your hand, either virtually or in the old-fashioned way like this, or put a question in the chat. Jamie, if you wouldn't mind monitoring the chat and making sure that we see questions as they come up, that would be great. So unless there are any particular questions, I see that also. I'll just mention Catherine Burgess has joined us. Catherine is a vice president for land use policy, land use and development at Smart Growth America, and this project is part of that program. So Catherine is going to be listening in for a while as well. Another ULI alum, as it turns out. So Catherine, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to get started, and I'll share my screen, unless there's any questions so far as I share my screen. Let me see. I know I can do that. There we go. Hold on a minute. All right, share your screen. Okay. I always forget to push the share button. So Can you see my screen? If you can, then it says you can see my screen. I will now go to the presentation format. And we'll get started as soon as it comes up. Oh, okay. Can you see that now? Can you see the presentation?
Yep. Looks
great.
good.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So to start with, here's our agenda for the day. I just talked through that. Well, reintroduce you to the SGA team who'll be working with you. And then Jordan is going to take over. And Jordan, you'll just let me know when you'd like me to advance slides to talk about the spatial analysis and model pro formas in the report that we did for the Walton Family Foundation. And then we'll talk about possible seminar topics. So we'll get started. You've met me and Jamie, and now you've met Jordan, who we've added to the team. So this is your SGA team for today. And Jordan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Marta. So good to be here. My background is in planning, so I love talking to planners. So let's get started. So just to give you a quick project overview, we teamed up with the Walton Family Foundation last year for this project. It built off their Our Housing Future report that showed how housing is becoming increasingly inaccessible to the Northwest Arkansas region for workers, families, and seniors. And Walton was very interested in finding out kind of the hard data behind that, what that kind of looks like, and then what could we do about it. They considered it for their strategy.
Sorry.
Oh, skate, yes.
There, sorry. I hit my mouse, but
as you can see in the table, we focused on the four what we called tier 1 cities of the area: Bentonville, Fayetteville, Rogers, and Springdale. By tier 1, we really meant the 4 largest cities in the region. We also did some analysis on some of the outer lying areas of Benton County and Washington County as well. So as you can see, all of this is from 2019, and you can see some of the rent changes, the for sale price increases, and I think something to keep in mind as we go through this is all the data, for the most part, was prior to COVID. And all of these numbers have gotten more difficult since then, given what we've seen, even in rents, which kind of took a dive in 2020 and have now come back, and definitely the for sale market. Kind of at the bottom, you see this owner-renter ratio of between Bentonville through Springdale, and you see how owners are very, very high in every area except for Fayetteville with the university. And then most importantly, perhaps the median income of the area. And you can see when we talk about low income workforce and market rate, how we define it. Sometimes you see market rate starting at 100% of an area's median income. We, I think, took a slightly better definition of acknowledging that workforce development is kind of 60 to 120, and you start getting up to market rate once you're at that 120 and over. So keep in mind, the overall point of this that we were trying to get out of this project was that the Northwest Arkansas region is growing fast. And so how do we create enough housing to both meet demand and ensure that housing remains affordable across all levels? Next slide, please. So the project was done in 2 phases, and I draw your attention to the highlighted portions: the spatial analysis of the current and future housing density, capacity, and land costs under existing law. And we modeled pro formas of residential projects that could be built in each of the 4 largest cities under the current ordinances. And we focused on the spatial analysis in the area and drafted these pro formas for hypothetical developments. And because we wanted to show the Walton Family Foundation what the area looks like, both from kind of this 10,000 foot level, like our spatial analysis, and then a very granular level of the pro formas. So that was our methodology. Next slide. So this suggested scenario focuses, this one I believe is just Rogers, just kind of for example. And this kind of lays out the existing zones, the potential housing unit capacity based on the zoning. And based on that zoning, how many more housing units could you fit in this area? And then when you really break it down to the housing in the area, what does it sort of look like? You know, you have a lot of capacity in the housing areas that allow for mixed use and duplexes and residential multifamily, right? But you don't have as much capacity for residential single family, which, much like many areas throughout the country, is the predominant land use zoning category in the area. So what we saw from this was, in lieu of continued expansion of sprawling low density housing, strategically targeted development achieved through a mix of regulatory and educational means could achieve greater housing unit capacity in, most importantly, a more fiscally responsible manner. Next slide. So then we did that for phase one. And phase two, we went back and we kind of did a similar exercise, but we assumed changes in these current policies. And so we did that for the spatial analysis, and we tried to evaluate the pro formas for affordability in different parts. And so it took everything a step further, and we looked at these changing policies and we asked, what could a different future look like for the Northwest Arkansas region? So next slide, please. So one thing that Smart Growth America conducts a lot, in nearly all of our TAs, are a fiscal hotspot analysis. I'm sure all of you have seen hotspot analysis done through GIS. We do it based on assessed property values normalized by acre. And so what that allows us to do is really see where an area is currently generating its net economic return from. And usually we see kind of center city, downtown locations kind of generate a higher per acre value versus more sprawled out locations, even if areas will kind of tell us initially, oh yeah, we generate a lot of that growth from our suburban strip mall over here. What we find is when we actually break it down on a per acre basis, you're actually not drawing as much net economic return as you potentially could. So similarly, for Northwest Arkansas, we saw that it was not achieving its highest economic potential based on land use patterns, and that this autocentric sprawl requires much more public investment per dollar than the land closer to downtown and other urban centers. This generally held through between each of the four cities. And we also generally find that these lower value areas are very difficult to retrofit with infill. There are some efforts in the area to do that. So you can also look over at one of our images. You can see Bentonville and Rogers. So even Rogers, that has a lot of colder spots, you know, areas that kind of as a cluster have lower value properties relative to the parcels around them. Even closer to the downtown area there, you still see that clustering of higher value. And of course, Bentonville. Now also say, you know, you can look at that in Rogers and you see at the bottom there that there is hotspots. That is generally when you see that, those kind of low density suburban areas. It's not that you're not generating like tax revenue, let's say, from it, but as I said, that they're difficult to retrofit and infill. Those areas historically and typically are much harder to change. You get a lot more resistance to any change in that land use around there versus kind of some of these downtown center city areas. So next slide. So this kind of lays out this housing need, and the phase one reports of our findings revealed this dominance of single family detached homes for projected new housing stock and a shortage of truly mixed use areas. That's not surprising to planners, right? We see that in a lot of places, but it's really revealing to many stakeholders when you kind of put it out this way. We saw that Fayetteville and Bentonville are somewhat similar. They've had some recent changes in planning and zoning that have been translated into improved patterns of development and housing density. And that does set some groundwork that we need to meet, that are needed to meet housing capacity needs. Springdale and Rogers have also adopted some best practices, for example, implementing form-based codes in their downtown areas. But neither city really contains these areas with relatively higher concentration of housing density or land values, which sort of brings their own challenges. So on this next slide, I circle Rogers because, like we had up earlier, we kind of went into detail on that one a little bit for our further analysis. But even just looking at this, you can see the bars kind of estimating the housing unit need based on projected population growth, and that really only Fayetteville has the estimated housing unit capacity available, while the three other cities fall very short. Bentonville is projected to explode in population. So this really lays out the need, I think, in a very good way. So you can go to the next slide. So here, when we went kind of more into detail, we wanted to visualize, okay, what does this housing shortage really look like? And so we mapped out a couple different scenarios. The first map on the left is, here's our current density, and this is in phase 2. Like, what does it look like right now? You see that the land is predominantly less than 2 acres per unit in density, and it really only goes up to about 6 units per acre. There's a couple multifamily developments here or there that you could see. So let's take that, don't change anything. What does it look like? You see that everywhere is just going to eventually rise based on need. There's nothing, the market is going to respond to the demand of the area. So everything sort of rises, everything is going to get built. You're not going to have these targeted patterns of development. But on the right side, with planning and with reports like ours and efforts by like the Walton Family Foundation, you can see that we can target these developments along corridors and downtown areas. So you might have higher observed densities in particular areas, but you see the retaining of more lower density single family areas. And ultimately what this does is it can potentially fill in that gap of what we all call missing middle housing. It allows people to afford to live in the type of place that they want, and it allows you to have more collaboration among stakeholders and not eliminate, but potentially lessen people accusing you of just destroying their community if you target this development in a fiscally responsible way. Next slide, please.
Hey, I have a question.
Of course.
On that, so is that just looking at current zoning codes, or does that take into consideration like the future land use maps and planning for, like, this is Rogers? Because I mean, they have a pretty targeted future land use
this
plan.
is kind of like regulation as is, and this was our, like, the targeted was sort of like our suggestion. So like future land use is future land use. We want to make sure that the underlying policies that go on there change. So it's just mapping out like one future and tries to put it in a visually appealing way for people, like just your general stakeholders who don't really think about what future land use looks like to them. They only know that they're going to get an apartment building up next to their house, and we want to show them what that could look like. So we're trying to broaden the audience base for it.
Okay, so it doesn't take into consideration the future land use plans that the city has. It's just if we keep going with the with things zoned as they are.
Keep going as is, yes.
Juliet, I think that brings up an important point, and something that we need to be reinforcing throughout the region over and over, and that is this. Many of our cities have really well-intentioned and frankly smart comprehensive land use plans. From a visioning point of view and a collaboration point of view, we have some remarkable best practices in place. Where sometimes the breakdown happens is changing that comprehensive vision agreed upon into regulatory language that actually drives the development patterns. And that continues to be a consistent challenge in our region as well as coast to coast. So it's just a reminder. It's a great point, Juliet, great question. And it's a reminder that we have to turn vision into regulation if we hope to achieve results at scale.
Okay, thanks.
So next slide, Marta. So we referenced this a few slides back with Bentonville, And what we found this parcel near downtown. You can see in 2013, maybe some of you recognize this area. We saw, and then 2013, it was a lower density single family home. And by 2019, a few townhomes went up. This is an example that shows an attractive and gentle increase in density, but the high cost of ownership for even these townhomes illustrates the affordability challenge in this region. One of these new townhome units still costs over $700,000. So you would need a yearly income, we calculated, of about 175% of the median income for the area to still afford this. So things are happening, but the demand in the area is rising so fast that it's right now not even happening fast enough, even with good policy changes. It's a good problem to have. The region is growing, the area is growing, but I think this really highlights this missing middle housing and the challenges that the area faces. So next slide. So looking at some key takeaways from our fiscal hotspot analysis and what we found, Bentonville, very high net economic returns. Kind of what I said with Rogers, the hotspots located in more auto-oriented residential subdivisions. Springdale, least amount of land covered by hotspots. Springdale has its own challenges, which I'll get into in a bit. And then Fayetteville are the hotspots near the university. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to highlight this per acre per value that I talk about to really put it in. We took these two examples of parcels. Example A is the smaller 6-acre area in downtown, and example B is nearly 32 acres south of 71. And when you look at it on paper, you look at the assessed value, and 513,000 is obviously greater than 323,000. But when you look at it, this assessed value per acre, you're generating a higher net economic return in your downtown area. Again, this is something that I know to planners seems obvious, but really breaking it down when you present this to regional stakeholders really puts it into a stark juxtaposition that I don't think a lot of people typically think about. So you're generating significantly more tax revenue for the city in this downtown area.
Jordan, if I may interrupt real quick, this is Jonathan Kurth with Fayetteville. And that was a theme I saw a lot in this report, and a mindset change I had to get when I came down here from the Kansas City area is that in Fayetteville, or not Fayetteville, Arkansas in general, sales tax is really what drives the success of a city fiscally. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that was something that y'all picked up on. I didn't really see it a lot covered in either of the phases, mm-hmm. but I feel like it's even more important in these instances where we're talking about, take that Bentonville property, for example, or $700,000, whatever, $750,000 townhouses. And that looks really great. The school district's really benefiting, but the city is only having one household there. Sure, it's probably a high income household, and sure, they're probably buying boutique groceries or whatever and generating more sales tax. But I feel like that for some of our leaders, if we're going to carry this conversation forward, property taxes is not as much of a benefit as it is in Arkansas, at least Northwest Arkansas, as I've seen in other regions.
So we did not evaluate based on property taxes. I've said like assessed value and value acre. Because from there we get into millage rates and we look at tax policy. And what we want to kind of show is that there's the opportunity for more kind of like housing growth. And with that, even in a sales tax state, if you get more people into this downtown area, right, then you can kind of increase that tax base on sales tax alone. You don't need to rely on property taxes, but we tried to focus on kind of like value and affordability and less on like, oh, well, if you increase your millage rate by, $100, here's how much you're going to get. But when you are talking, and I say tax revenue on this slide because, yeah, if you're going to do it based on assessed value per acre on a when you normalize it, you're going to generate more. But that's an absolutely fair point to keep in mind for this region. Where are you generating your tax revenue from? So, yes, excellent question and comment, and it's definitely something to keep in mind.
Yeah, on the sales tax note, Jonathan, shameless plug here. Google me or YouTube me and TEDx talk. I gave a TEDx talk on exactly this, pressed by my city leaders in the city of Conway about sales tax and how most of our revenue comes from sales tax, not ad valorem. I ran the numbers on the top 10 highest performing national chain restaurants in the city of Conway. That's Chick-fil-A, a couple of McDonald's, Chili's, Outback Steakhouse, things like that. Looking at how much sales, I was able to see sales tax data because of our hamburger tax. And I could demonstrate that small downtown mom and pop restaurants in a storefront are up to 19 times more powerful per square foot of productive landscape than even Chick-fil-A, which is the highest performing gross performer in the city of Conway. And that's because Chick-fil-A was 2.5 acres, yet their dining room or the entire structure itself was only several thousand square feet. Most of that lot, as well as the infrastructure that supports that lot, is going, frankly, to a very low performing Chick-fil-A. And a small downtown restaurant was outperforming at 19-1 per square foot and didn't even require any parking because it was all on street public. So the numbers continue to bear out. It's more challenging to achieve them because of the sales tax privatization by the Department of Finance here at the state. But you can use your city's hamburger and hospitality tax or A&P commission taxes to make some really valid interpolations of the data and tell that story to your community leaders, because I think it's a valid question, sales tax versus property tax.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I think that's absolutely a mechanism and tool. And yes, I've seen your TED talk. Again, it's all for me about branding, because I guess if we get into later, I feel like the education piece of this conversation is the most powerful. And a Chick-fil-A is the goose that laid the golden egg, if you get one in town, from a lot of people's perspective. And all they see are those drive-through lines backed out on the streets, and how that interprets or how that converts to sales taxes, as opposed to, like you said, a downtown restaurant that may be just as powerful or more so. So yeah, wasn't saying it to be disagreeable. I just, the themes I hear in this area is always talking about sales tax, sales tax, sales tax, and it can't be ignored.
Jonathan, I think your point is well taken, that the revenue structures and sources is different in this area. But one other thing to keep in mind, I think, which is on the cost side, and the cost to service more compact, diverse areas is much lower, obviously, than for a local government to service low density sprawl, which is perhaps generating less revenue or may not be, but it certainly is a lot more expensive to service. And when we do our fiscal analysis, not necessarily a hotspot analysis, we look at that. And so there is a difference in the cost of servicing different development patterns that's separate from, regardless of whether your revenues are coming from sales tax or real estate taxes. So just another thought to keep in mind.
Yeah, I always try to talk about linear feet of water, sewer, and street per unit or per business, and it's hard to get people to think that way, but it's important.
Right, or your fire services or your police services, the further they have to go and the more area they have to cover, the more expensive it is. So that's another argument that we can build out when we're talking about fiscal analysis for different forms of development.
Definitely.
Thanks.
All right, Jordan.
Yeah, we can move to the next slide.
Yeah.
So now we get into the model pro formas. And for those of you who do not know, a pro forma is just a projection of a development project's financials. You know, it looks at revenue, income, expenses, costs, and use certain assumptions. You make assumptions, you can change those assumptions. It's how developers kind of quote unquote pencil out developments to see if they're even going to be feasible to do. So on this slide are just some key terms that can let you guys just read through. These are generally what we kind of look at. You know, we made some assumptions, right, on affordable unit set-asides, what's the density is going to look like, how much money the developer is going to want to make from it. You know, there's some industry standards for those. And so next slide, Marta. So we did see some overall trends and findings. And I think these are some of the key takeaways, that financial feasibility for developments are impossible at like the prevailing average rents in the area. Downtown Fayetteville was an exception. And sometimes you can have mixed use developments, right? The zoning asks for that. Between when we spoke with a lot of regional developers, when we had our partners Dover Kohl, who did a lot of the zoning analysis for this, we asked a lot about, well, what if you have retail income? And the developers all said the same thing. The residential income is going to determine the ultimate viability. They're happy to do ground floor retail if that's what the zoning requires, if that's going to make them, but like they're going to generate their money from residential income, and that's what's going to determine if they go through with the project. So we found in general that to achieve acceptable returns, projects must have rents of at least 120% of the median income, and this ground floor retail. And projects outside of the downtown areas must have rents of at least 150% to achieve feasibility. And then we also found that rents are increasing in the region, and say this is prior to this past year. So it's even more of an issue now. 5 years before, we saw that downtown areas on average increased by nearly 8%. And these edge areas, which we basically defined as anything within city limits outside of our defined downtown areas, at nearly 13%. And kind of most concerningly, the cheapest rents are from Springdale, but they are decreasing the fastest in all parts of the city. And in general, you can kind of see where the market is moving and the demand is moving. It's going to where the cheapest place is right now.
Hey, can you go back to the previous slide for just a second?
That one?
Yeah, so on the bottom where it says density, so you're defining that as the number of dwelling units allowed on a parcel, not like per acre?
Parcel acre, yeah, it takes it, and when I did it, it does it on like a unit on a per acre basis, yeah, but this is just a definition for people to know, like, yep, it's the number of units that I assumed was going to be on here.
Right, so this is because the analysis is being done at the parcel level for the purpose of the pro formas. So the density is the number of dwelling units allowed on the parcel, because the pro forma is specific to the parcel.
Yeah.
Does that
I think it makes it more deliverable and understandable for your local and regional officials too, because, from experience in public hearings, you say, oh, 12 units per acre are allowed on this parcel. Nobody knows what that means. The next question is, how many units can they put on this piece of land?
Right.
Okay, so but the analysis is units per acre, not units on a parcel. Okay.
Yeah.
It depends on what you're analyzing, Juliet. In this case, what you're trying to figure out is, do the numbers for this particular project pencil out? And one way to know that is to know how many units you can build on this parcel. And that's determined by the zoning on an per acre basis. But let's say the parcel is 1/4 of an acre or 3 acres. And so in order to do the pro forma, you need to say, well, if we've got 1/2 an acre and the allowable density is 10 units per acre, that means that we can only assume we're going to be able to build out 5 units on this parcel.
Okay, I understand now. I was thinking like I wasn't understanding exactly how you were doing that, but that makes sense to me.
Okay, all right. No, it's a good question. It's, again, this, here you have to think like a developer, not like a planner. Thanks. Okay.
You can go the next slide after this one now too. We'll look at some of the results of these pro formas, and without going too into detail on them, the red on this slide sticks out with Fayetteville as feasible, right? You can look at the fine print based on 100% of this median income, using industry standards for these costs and this profit, and just shows you how difficult it is for developers, just on what is affordable, and on the average, and whether it's downtown or whether it's the edge.
So
So-
Jordan, this table is answering, what is the question that this slide is answering?
The developer is going to plug in a lot of these numbers, right? They're going to plug in the rents based on how many units they can do, the parking requirements. Parking has a cost associated with it that we all know. They're going to plug in these numbers, and the developer is going to look, and they're going to say that my costs are going to exceed my revenues on all of these projects with the exception of Fayetteville. I'm going to do really well in Fayetteville.
Is
right?
this even without assuming any affordable units, any income restricted units?
I believe we did a set aside of 20% for everything.
Okay, so these numbers assume a 20% set aside for rents that are affordable at
60%.
At 60%. Okay, so what you're showing us here is that if a developer who's building there's no subsidy or anything, but if a developer, for example, is required to have 20% of their units be income restricted to people at 60% of AMI, the project won't pencil out.
So you're not even going to get past the pro forma with this. Well, they will, but they're going to propose. That's why a lot of times you see, I see it all the time, new apartment buildings, and you'll see new, rents starting at some outrageous number on, right, when you look at it. And it's because developers are doing these things, but like, well, I can do this development, but this is what I have to charge
In rents.
So here's the next slide. Or next slide.
Quick question. What were those area median incomes? Was that for what year?
The most recent year available, I believe at the time it was 2019.
Okay.
So it's changed now, and that's going to change some of like these numbers where you put it in for 2020 and 2021. So I'm not sure what that would look like, but I am very sure that the affordability numbers are going to look worse given where the market has been the past couple of years. So next slide.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that people see if anybody else has questions about this slide. Okay.
So then we looked at projected and we tried to make it work. How could this be possible? And its feasibility at what you frequently look at as luxury rent levels, beginning at 120% and up to 150 of it. And then up there on the right, that's what these household incomes kind of look like at 120%. And you can do this mixed use dense development with these affordable units at that level. And importantly, it's absent any market intervention such as any subsidies or tax credits. So, if LIHTC is going around, if there's a possibility for some Section 8 units, that changes the math for a developer. But if you're just looking at the straight market, and let's say an area decides to adopt an inclusionary zoning policy, or a developer just, an affordable housing developer believes in this, this is kind of what they're looking at. And they can say, okay, I can charge these rents, and then I can somewhat subsidize with those rents these affordable units. And then we found with like potential densities in each of the area of like what you could potentially go up to, kind of playing an average, looked at kind of some average land sizes. So there's a lot of assumptions that get made in this. For that retail income, we used CoStar data in the area. Retail, and I think this is one thing that developers know, is extremely volatile. That retail income after the past year or so might even be less. Land costs were cited by developers as a region or as a reason not to go through with some developments. But you see kind of some scenarios between some average of downtown parcels and available parcels, what it kind of looks like. Even that Fayetteville one that's in red is pretty close. You could probably get up to feasibility in that. So this shows you what needs to happen for a developer to at least get to the point of, I can make this work.
So, and by making this work, you mean I can include income restricted units,
Yes.
but it has to be mixed use, and it has to be the other
Well, this makes it work I'd sketch it out to make it work with mixed use.
Yeah. So if you put in mixed use, and if the non-income restricted units are at least 120%, then you can cross-subsidize some affordable units at 60% of MHI. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying here.
So next slide, we then took this.
I had a question really quick. Tim Conklin with regional planning. And are you saying that when you look at density, going back to Juliet's question, so in Bentonville, you need, am I reading this right, 50 units per acre based on parcel, 40 for Fayetteville, 31 for Rogers, 24 for Springdale? Or am I reading this wrong or interpreting it
We
wrong?
saw
Thanks.
for the available ones, Dover Kohl, when they did the zoning, saw that like if you were to do for those available ones, kind of like highest available like observed density, and it might even be on 1 acre. It might not actually be somewhere that, you know, allows 50 acres, but that's what is on paper potentially available for it, and what you could kind of raise it up to get to that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So the housing costs are just one half of this. And when we kind of took some of these numbers and went a step further, we also looked at transportation costs, particularly in auto-centric environments. Some of you may have heard of the Center for Neighborhood Technology and their Housing and Transportation Index. And according to CNT, a household's combined income between housing and transportation should be no more than 45% of its income. So we wanted to see what that looked like in the Northwest Arkansas area. And on the next couple slides, you'll see the lower or more green the number is, the more affordable it is, and the higher or more red, the less affordable. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Marta. So I circled, you know, at 100% because here's like the median income for the area right here. We looked at a downtown mid-rise of anywhere between 4 and 7 stories if you were to build a edge townhouse development. The assumption here, by the way, is all rental. And then we did outer, CoStar have submarkets of outer central Benton County and then southeast Washington County. So we also sort of demonstrated what it would look like there. Transportation costs are the lowest in a downtown area. They're highest in the outer area. When speaking with some developers, they would talk to us about how much cheaper it was for them to build in these outer areas, which is fine for developers, but when you're thinking about affordability, for the lower income people, it really starts to cost burden them. And you see that this H&T index doesn't really get to mostly green until you get to 120% of the median income. It only starts approaching it even at 100%. And for lower income, 60, 80, to say nothing of 30 or 50, it's very low. You can just see the cost burden nature of this at these rents. So next slide, Marta.
So it just, again, and at the risk of being redundant, that the goal for H&T is 52%. Is that right? That's sort of an acceptable percentage of median income. So anything that is over 52% of median income, housing and transportation costs combined.
45, Marta.
Oops, I'm sorry, what?
45%.
45, okay, so not 52. So the goal is 45% of median income for housing and transportation combined. And so if you go over 45, then that household is cost burden. So that would be why all of the numbers that are over 45% are trending toward red. And all of the numbers that are less than 45% are trending toward green. Is that right?
Yeah, and I know if you've looked at this, you've seen Fayetteville kind of oscillates at slides between being really good and really unaffordable. The university, for its wonderful economic asset, because of the student population and the transient population and some of the lower wage workers that support the university, it kind of can throw things off depending on what you're looking at. At the end of the day, the university is a huge asset and it's good, but it is good to kind of paint this picture of what it looks like on the average. So just kind of keep that in mind when you look at Fayetteville and you're like, in one analysis, it looks amazing, and on the other one, it looks horribly unaffordable.
Especially when the university is not building any housing and all our students are having to get further and further from campus and spend more money driving.
So, and there's a lot of students who definitely qualify as low income. And if you're spending close to 90% of your income on housing and transportation, it's going to be a real problem. So next slide. So then we wanted to project this out. So we know what it's going. And again, I would caution that this probably looks worse now. If we were to shift the 5-year window from 2014 to 2019 to 2016 to 2021, these numbers, there'd probably be a lot more red. But I think you can also see Springdale, which I referred to earlier, has the fastest rent growth. It's going to have the biggest affordability challenges, particularly at people who make 100% or less than 100% of the median income. The rents are going to grow. People are going to continually be attracted to that area because of the lower rents, the lower cost of living. So in some sense, you're going to see things maybe in some areas kind of get better because their rent growth might be slower. It might outpace the rent, or their wages might keep up with the rent growth a little better. But you're going to have other areas, particularly in Rogers, Springdale, and some of the outer areas, that are going to look a little worse. So what does that exactly look like? We looked at the projected 5-year change on the next slide. And as I said, in the downtown areas, things might modestly get better for some populations. Not a whole ton, nothing even gets over 1% better, but might be a little better. Springdale gets substantially worse. And these outer areas, the areas where we know developers can currently build and build large units with plentiful parking, are going to get harder for people to afford. So my big takeaways from this is modest improvements in the downtown areas. Cost will largely keep up with income, except for Springfield, as it's currently the cheapest and market is chasing that demand. The edge and outer areas are currently cheap for developers to invest in, but the costs will get worse in these to varying levels. And again, this likely understates the issue now, given COVID increases in housing. In 2020, we saw a dip on a lot of rents nationwide, and that has come back starting in late 2021 and definitely early 2022. The indications are rents are increasing again with a vengeance. So next slide, Marta. Okay, so
what I have a question, actually. Can you go back? I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Okay. So what we're comparing here, because I think this is interesting, because a lot of the demand is, of course, for some sort of single family detached, right? But the only place that you're actually even looking at the single family detached is on the outer garden, or whatever you're calling it.
So even on those outer garden ones, and I stress that this is a multifamily analysis, we did not, about the single family market is different. This looks at rent affordability for it. So that's why we looked at a mid-rise, a townhouse development, and a garden style apartment complex. That's what garden is, which is usually 1 to 3 stories, kind of lower level, usually separate buildings, plentiful parking. So the single family market would be completely unaffordable for anybody here, right? To get 5-10% down. So looking at that would kind of require a separate analysis. We looked at it under the spatial analysis as a sense of well, it's going to be very difficult for you to meet your housing needs. If you only invest in single family homes, you're going to continue to have to go farther out, which has an impact on the fiscal health of your community here. But in terms of affordability, we're still looking at the rental population, of which Northwest Arkansas has a substantial amount of. And so it's not that we only looked at single family homes in the outer area. We looked at 4 rental apartments in the outer area. In these edge cities, quote unquote, we looked at this townhome development, and you could kind of put a single family rental in that as well. But we've seen increasingly throughout the country these kind of 4 rental townhome developments popping up. And then in downtown areas, if you're going to match, especially in a form-based code area, you're going to be more likely to see these lower mid-rise developments with ground floor retail. So we tried to at least match up potential land use in each of these 3 areas and not get too into the weeds with the for sale single family market, which is going to be different.
But in Jordan, we did, in terms of looking that these numbers in terms of affordability are going to be better than single
income is income. Yes, it's going to be
Yeah.
better. You're going to pay less. Yes. So in that sense, yes, because when you look at housing costs in it, but we did it based on rents. You could do it and substitute a mortgage, right? And you could sort of imagine, what are you paying per square foot in a downtown condo, in an edge townhouse, and then perhaps in a suburban style. And you know, your income is your income and your costs are costs, and that's fine. But we did do the analysis in mind with the rental market.
Okay, so you did rents, and then that is further controlled for okay, so the rents that you're looking at in the outer garden area, those are based on only rents in multifamily structures in those areas?
Yes, it's CoStar data, which tracks the rental market.
I understand the rental I don't know what CoStar is, but I mean, there's a
So
lot of
CoStar
rental market that is single family.
Is a basically a commercial real estate research firm, and they track rents for various income generating properties, whether it's office, retail, industrial, multifamily. They're kind of the go-to for this sort of data. They have people who literally call up these developments and survey them all across the country. They're in a market like this. They're at least in every mid-sized market. So this is rental data from those income generating properties in that area. They have defined this submarket as Southeast Washington County and outer central Benton County. We then are able to take what each of these Bentonville, Fayetteville, Rogers, and Springdale defined as their downtown areas, and we were able to draw the income generating multifamily properties in those areas and then take the remaining ones within their city limits for the same thing.
So, but the question I think is, because so much of this market is single family detached, is there anything that we can infer from these numbers, which are multifamily, not detached? Is there anything that we can infer about the single family, even if it's single family rental market in these areas?
I think you can infer the affordability challenges at any of these income levels. You know, obviously,
right, the transportation costs are going to be the same or even higher because the densities are lower, so people are having to drive further, and the rents are going to be the same or higher, and the costs are going to be the same or higher. So I think these are good indicators, even for the single family detached market. If anything, it's going to be worse. Is that a fair?
Yes, you have your own cost burdens for that as well.
Right.
The cost of home ownership.
I think maybe what Julia was getting at is that this is not maybe as helpful as having that single family kind of analysis. As far as I know, I live in Southeast Washington County. If there are garden style apartments, there would be very few, maybe some duplexes, a couple of fourplexes, but not really any kind of the garden level apartments that you're describing. So I just think for our area, this maybe is not the most intuitive because we don't have this kind of development. So that's perhaps the reason that we're struggling here, because it doesn't, align with what exists now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I guess during our conversations with developers, when we ask them in the area, when we ask them about this, that's what to us they told us was the most attractive style of development if they were going to build out there. Whether or not that has happened yet, remember, these are projected changes. We're trying to make some projections of what could happen as opposed to like what will. And as I've said, the single family market is a huge part of it, but that has its own cost challenges for the area. And as Marta alluded to, you can infer the same sort of kind of like affordability difficulties for that based on the median income and based on your housing and transportation costs in the area. So I'm not trying to come in and tell you guys, this is what your land use is definitively going to look like, and this is what it looks like in the area. Ultimately, you guys as the planners in the area are the masters of your own destiny. But what I do want to lay out is kind of these affordability challenges in the area and potentially what could be done to alleviate them.
And Jordan and Marta, please correct me if I'm wrong. One of my understandings of both phase 1 and phase 2 of this project was to assess the landscape, the housing landscape, find where our gaps are and what the obstacles are to the region to getting towards more affordability and a diversity of housing. And one of those most targeted pieces of that were that we are missing middle housing, which more often than not tends to be that rental housing market. And what you're pointing out here, at least from my perspective, is that this represents a potential challenge to continue to creating this type of housing.
Mm-hmm.
It does, and I think we definitely identified barriers. Some were regulatory, some were just knowledge and education, and we'll talk about that when we dig more deeply into a conversation about design guidelines, but also just knowledge of how to build and whether to build and whether there's a market for the missing middle housing. But Courtney, I understand your point, and I understand that this is predominantly a single family market. Those numbers were because those are often individually owned and rented, that it's a lot harder to get that data. But I think it's that these numbers, although they're multifamily, and so it's the minority, it's a lot smaller percentage of the market. I think that the challenges, that the affordability challenges, are either the same or greater, and the likelihood of future supply because of the cost of delivering single family housing. I think the future market is going to be increasingly multifamily for moderate income, and you have the challenges here that are the affordability challenges plus some others on the single family market. So I think you're going to see less and less. Does that track with your understanding of the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a goal, for us to get to. So I understand that.
Yeah.
But also it's a little discouraging that like even our goal, even our attempts at density are not enough. Yeah.
Your current attempts, future attempts, if we can figure out why they're not sufficient and what needs to change to deliver more. And that's really, I think, what we hope to do over the next few months, is say our current attempts are not getting us there. And what else do we need to do to step up on the supply side so that we can meet our housing number goals, but also in terms of how those number of units are distributed across different household income levels. And I think, what we're saying here is you have your work cut out for you, but we also have some thoughts about how you address it.
A question. So, I mean, my understanding is, yes, obviously we have the missing middle housing, and this is kind of the projections of where we need to go, to address some of our housing needs. even if we do, like reach almost, most of all the numbers we need for, higher density, homes and residential housing, would this help control the exponential like market increase for single family homes? I mean, a lot of the outlying communities, the smaller communities outside of the four big ones, most all of the rentals are single family homes. And that's where the cost is really getting driven up, is the single family market. And then just one thing I would maybe add to challenges for that, for higher density homes, is buy-in from people that already have single family homes and they don't want it there. That's always difficult. And then just maybe some education and infrastructure, to get those things in those areas.
Yeah, David, I think you're right. I mean, when I talked about the issues not being, the obstacles not being just regulatory, I think that's what I was saying, is that this is just not a style of housing that people in the community are familiar with or think they want, and maybe they don't. I mean, you can't tell people this isn't, you don't want what you want something else. But often it's a matter of not knowing what the options are. And particularly because the cost of delivering single family detached housing is going to continue to go up, and you're going to have households that want and need to be in the region, but the single family detached market is just not going to be affordable, and or it's going to be so dispersed that transportation costs are going to be so high that it's not going to be feasible. And so when you factor in the affordability, then you can open a conversation. Well, how can you have the same quality of housing or the same type of housing that may be designed differently, but it will reduce your transportation costs and be more affordable because of the way the units are designed? Then you can begin to have a conversation about what are those options. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I mean, the more dense we get, in certain areas, I mean, the less cost it is for everybody involved, the cities, the homeowners, et cetera, whether it's transportation or infrastructure or whatnot.
Yeah, but there's not common awareness of that at this point, would be my assumption.
I don't know. I'm trying to process all this.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I have I'm trying to think of the best way to ask this or say this. It's a weird cycle, because so your charts show that, right, technically Fayetteville has an adequate number of units, right? Or more.
No, we show that Fayetteville has the capacity for it, not that they have an adequate number of units right now, but they do have the existing theoretical zoning capacity. If they built to capacity, they could do it without changing anything. So they're a little different than anybody, but nobody currently has enough housing.
Right. Okay. So what I consistently see in development, and I mean, honestly, this may just be because, we live in a privately driven development world and it's capitalist, right? And so people just consistently are there's no incentive really to do anything besides what makes a development the most profitable. And as long as there's an ample supply of people who are willing to pay over that, whatever the 45 or whatever percent or 60 or 120, because I know you have like you have your median income, but there's a large number of people who have quite a bit of money up here. So as long as there's people who will pay, then even if you give them more density as a city to build, what I consistently see is not that somebody builds, when they build the higher density, it's still like at a luxury level. It's not affordable housing, because if they build a higher density of the luxury apartments, they can make more money than if they're building a higher density of non-luxury apartments, and there's still people to buy them, right? And so why would they not do that? And that's kind of, whenever I've asked that question, and the same thing in single family markets, you know, they're like, oh yeah, well, we can build smaller homes now, but they're not really building smaller affordable homes. They're building smaller luxury homes, because then people pay more and then their profit margin is higher. And it's like this endless cycle, right? And there's no way to mandate affordability, since it's private market driven, right? Unless the cities are actually, you know, funding part of those projects themselves. I don't know. I mean, I guess at some point it levels out, but it's so hard. From what I've seen, it's very hard to play with the market numbers. Even if you add all this density, you never get where you need to be. Does that make sense?
So I'll go off of the analysis a little bit and just kind of speak to like real estate in general. And I hear kind of like this argument like a lot. In fact, my boss, Chris Zimmerman, frequently makes this argument when it comes to supply. But my opinion on it is we're not even close anywhere in the country to building an adequate amount of supply. So you are going to continue to see these luxury developments built with high rents, because developers can keep doing it until we, not just as like a region, but like as a country, just get like and understand the fact that like we build way less housing even now. And it seems like I live in DC, there's cranes everywhere, but that is still not enough housing with what you need to actually keep up with demand. And I think it's hard as planners, or even if you have a county commission, even if you have a state government. I mean, with California and everything, they have a state government that's very like understands that they have a housing issue. But until we as a society build enough housing to keep up with our massive population growth, we're going to just keep seeing, well, we just added 3 new buildings, each of them, and they're all luxury level. And that's not wrong, because that is what's happening. But I just don't think, before we get into like subsidies and tax credits and other market interventions, I just don't think that we have anywhere close to the adequate amount of supply, particularly in a growing region like Northwest Arkansas. It's like, it's a great problem to have. You're growing, people want to live there, right? They want to go in, there's jobs, but how do you do this? And I think, and it's one thing, and I don't really want to speak to the zoning specifically, because Dover Kohl did that for our report. And they had their own suggestions on what to do, but until we sort of allow more housing to be built, and it's going to be way beyond what I think people think is necessary, you're just going to have these affordability problems everywhere, and it's going to continue to get worse. I mean, the only other thing for the single family is like maybe the Fed's going to raise interest rates, and instead of having these dirt cheap houses, maybe the single family market cools off, but that's just going to move people to the rental market, and you're going to have the same problem. So I am definitely of like, it's the supply, and that's like my personal opinion. Like, but you know, even my direct superior, Chris Zimmerman, disagrees with that and just calls me a millennial who thinks it's all about supply. So
well, I'm not saying it's not about supply, but I don't see anywhere in that incentive that you talked about. You're like, okay, well, we just don't have enough. But where's the incentive to actually build enough to where there's not a supply problem? Because as long as there's a supply problem, then you can always drive up prices. And so I guess that's the part I don't know. I don't really know. It just seems like, in my mind, it seems like this endless cycle, and it never gets better. And I'm not saying like we shouldn't, you know, add density wherever we can. I'm all for all of that. I just trying to think through the whole problem and like a real solution. I don't know. I just end up back in this circle.
I think laying it out like this though, and it's easy because like we do this for a living, right? We can see for the lay person, they're like, oh yeah, affordable. Oh yeah, I tried to buy a house and like it was expensive. But really laying out, well, here's how much housing you actually will need, and here's how much you can currently build. Laying that out, particularly to stakeholders, like it was very illuminating even for like the Walton Family Foundation, people there who just, those, they can afford to buy a house, and kind of laying those numbers out. And that's really what this part of the analysis with the spatial analysis and affordability did, was really lay out in terms of like, here's the issue at hand. And in our recommendations, we have that, like, leverage these metrics when you go out and you're talking to the stakeholders, like, this is how much money you need to make. And one of my community of practice or questions that I would ask is, instead of talking about rents per square feet and everything, it's asking the developer, well, how much money is it going to take to actually live here when you're building this development? How much, not like, oh, because developers talking per square foot, and to normal people that means absolutely nothing. But like, is it, how much is it going to cost? 50,000, 75,000, 150,000? And once you have these metrics, you can then begin to have like this conversation. And I think it's really easy for us to all sort of talk to each other and be like, what do we do? But I think that education process everywhere hasn't even begun. And I think at least with stakeholders like Walton, the largest employer in your region, I think there is that pathway to potentially address it and maybe come up with something, and the region may become a model for the rest of the country.
Very exciting, Jordan. Juliet, thanks for the dialogue. I really value it. Sherry, I know you got a question. I just want to remind everybody that next month we'll be talking with developers at Fiscal. It's going to be a wonderful opportunity for you all in this room to pose some of these very same questions to the people who make a living turning dirt and putting houses on the landscape of varying typologies and varying price points, varying locations. So please keep the questions coming. But in the interest of time, we only have about 14 minutes left. And I know that Marta wants to look forward. As Jordan finishes up his presentation, Marta is going to want to visit with you about the policy and practice seminars. So I want to make sure we save time for that. Before we move on, Sherry, I know you've been waiting patiently. Do you have something you want to finish on this part of the conversation for us?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I've really done a lot of research on community land trusts and property tax caps as ways to, the property tax caps, Juliet's argument still goes very well to that. The developer can say he's going to have lower prices, but what he actually does is a different thing. But with the community land trust, it's like having a POA, so we can, like, the city could donate land to community land trust, or there's multiple ways to do that. Property owners can donate their land to a community land trust, and the community land trust acts like a POA, which has them sign contracts that they cannot charge more than X amount for this amount of apartments, or for all of the dwelling units on the property. And that way they become the policeman for the price instead of us. And then, speaking to what Jordan said, I just wanted to say that anecdotally, I don't know how true it is, but I've heard that other countries love how cheap our property is and that we buy everything. And so potentially we don't have a cap on enough houses because somebody else will buy them and we'll be paying another somebody else for higher prices housing. So I think something, if we can have somebody else to police the price, that's a good option.
Super. Thank you, Sherry. Good input. Hey, Jordan, if you want to finish up, I know you only had, you're getting near the end of your presentation. Feel free to finish up. Thanks you guys so much.
Yeah, I mean, Marta, in the interest of time, we can just show these, we can share these slides with everybody as well. I know, like, we went over just quickly, these 6 recommendations are kind of what we did. The bold, all of these are important. The bolded ones are that I felt most particularly or important or pertinent to this affordability. Not that engaging the right partners in education and outreach isn't unimportant, but regional approach to housing and transportation, leveraging these metrics. I italicized and put an asterisk by zoning code because, as I've said, Kohl Partners did that part of the analysis, and I didn't want to speak to that and step on their toes or say something that did not actually come through with them. But reforming zoning codes is of interest. And this is the last thing that I have, just some suggestion on these community practice questions. I said it during our last discussion about how much somebody make. Maybe some of these questions you might ask when you talk to developers. Things, these are just some suggestions of what they may have in mind, and can kind of help you kind of put your developer hat on, think what are they gonna think through when they're doing these developments, and what should we be thinking through as a region with some of these. And I think these are just kind of some initial questions. There'll be more there, but money, gap financing, regulatory, and then we had a thing about like the master plan and the future land use and zoning. And I wrote this question a few days ago before that, but I'm glad that like people are thinking that way. How does this development align with our community's goals? And I think that's a very important question to ask. And that's all I have.
So thanks, Jordan. A lot to think about. And as we move into the next section, Juliet, I hear your frustration. And I think our experience has been that over time, it is possible to influence the market. And the more you know about the market and how these numbers show where the pressure points are, the more strategic you can be. So over the next few months, we're going to talk about some of those tools that other communities have used to actually influence the market, like community land trusts. And we'll have the chance to talk back and forth with developers and others about what changes in terms of zoning or permitting and some of these others could be used to leverage more affordability. So it's not it isn't a daunting task, but not an impossible one. And I think that's what we're going to spend the next few months. And ultimately, then we will put all of this information in a toolkit, which each of you can take back to your own communities and figure out which of these market interventions are going to work best in your community. So take heart, and I'm optimistic. And so at least give us a chance to have these conversations. But I think your points are very well taken. What I want to do quickly now, excuse me, is talk a little bit about the seminar topics that we've been thinking about and thinking how to organize the topics that you identified in your workshop in a way that's going to be the most helpful to you. And I think what we will do is that for each seminar, regardless of the topic, we will identify thought leaders and bring some of them into the conversation in person, if possible, bring them to Northwest Arkansas. But now we also know that we can tap into a much wider range of expertise virtually. And so we'll probably be using that platform as well. I think we will also, regardless of the topic, we will then focus in on the highlights. What are the key subtopics that we want to cover? And also, what are the key challenges with regard to those topics in Northwest Arkansas? We will then go into lessons learned, both through our research, through your experience, and try and identify those. So, for example, if the topic is impact fees, or if it's administrative processes and the subtopic is impact fees, then we'll talk about, well, what lessons have we learned from talking to developers, from changing those or using those selectively to expedite or encourage the development of a wider range of housing types. We will also include some best practice examples so we can show you how these tools and strategies have been applied in other communities. And then we'll bring in some ideas for resources where you can learn more about these topics. And so this is how we envision approaching each of these seminar topics. And hopefully this will be all documented in the toolkit that Deborah's going to be working on. So we had agreed to 6 seminars, but we think that there are at least 7 topics, again, based in part on the issues and challenges that you identified in your December workshop. And our thought is that we would organize them this way, that we would include a 7th topic, because we think financing strategies is a really critical conversation. And each month, starting in April, we would tackle one of these, so that in April, we would talk about diversifying housing supply. And then we would address each of these sort of macro topics over the course of the next 7 months. So now what I want to do is just dig down a little deeper on each of these. And I guess what I'd like to hear from you as we go through these are our beginning to organize the topics within these headings, and the possibility of some leaders, thought leaders, that we might want to include either in person or virtually. And so I wanted to introduce these to you, and then have you add topics either in this conversation, or perhaps, Megan, maybe we'll put these up as Google Docs that can be added to or edited. We can talk about how to do this, but maybe we'll put these on the shared drive so that people can go back and add other topics. But so, for example, in April, we've identified the mega topic as how can you diversify your housing supply? And that would include a more extended conversation about missing middle housing. What do we mean by missing middle housing? What are some examples? What are some resources that you can tap into to learn more about what we mean by missing middle housing? And briefly, what we mean by missing middle housing is it's everything that is not single family detached or not high-rise multifamily. It's kind of everything in between. But that is also what's missing in much of the Northwest Arkansas region. And so we'll talk about how do you talk about missing middle housing in a way that people understand what it is and can perhaps see themselves in it, whether it's a developer or a consumer. We'll also talk about project design standards, and then we can add some other subtopics in this area. And on the right, you can see, I think having a developer like Ward who is in the Northwest Arkansas region, talk about sort of the challenges and opportunities for developing a wider range of housing at a wider range of price points. A local planner who's had some experience with achieving the development of missing middle housing. And when we talk about missing middle housing, we're talking both from a design perspective. So like the images that we saw in Bentonville, where we went from 1 unit on a piece of property to, I think it was 3, but we're also talking about missing middle in terms of price point diversity. And so someone pointed out, those townhouses were more expensive for each unit than the single unit that was on the site originally. And how do you also encourage price diversity as well as design diversity? So that's sort of what we're thinking about for the first topic. Was there a question? I can't see you guys.
Yes, Marta, this is Wes. Pardon me for interrupting you. I want to give you an opportunity to go through the remainder of your slides, but acknowledge that we're at 1 o'clock effectively in about another minute or a minute and a half. And I know some of you all may be on a hard stop, have a meeting to get to immediately following this. If you need to fall off, just let me say thanks first off for joining us today. I hope you got a lot out of this. We will be following up via email with a Google Doc that you can provide input to. maybe a Question Pro survey. Would love to get your thoughts on questions for our developers, give you an opportunity to shape that conversation that we're going to have next month. So look forward to some additional communications from us. If you can stick around for a little while longer, please do, and we'll be as fast as we can. But I know that Marta wants to continue looking into the summer's activities. Again, Marta, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to make sure I got that out before the top of the hour.
Yeah, and I will need to head out pretty soon too. So I will move quickly through these. And then Megan will work to get these up on a shared drive where people can add to them. The second topic is zoning reform. We'll do a deep dive, ideally with Joe Kohl, who did the analysis that's in the Walton reports. But these are some of the other topics, and we can add to those that we would include in the conversation on zoning reform. Administrative hurdles is one that we heard when we did our interviews there. And also I know you identified topics within administrative hurdles when you had your workshop last month. Linking land use and mobility, that's where the H&T costs come in. And how do we do that in a way that's going to diversify mobility options, which is the best way to reduce costs? So we will spend one of our seminars talking about that. Communications and advocacy. This is sort of falls in the category of education. How do you communicate to people that there is a different way to live, to build, to design that is going to be more cost effective, both for the local government and also for the consumer? Seminar 6, there were a whole group of externalities that you identified in your workshop last month, and we've put some of them in here, and we'll continue to add to this list and then match some of our thought leader speakers to some of these topics. And then the bonus seminar on financing, looking at ways to impact the cost of delivering delivering housing, which would then be passed on to the consumer. And so that really looks at packaging and everything from community land trusts to public-private partnerships. And so this is a huge topic, and we may even break it down further, but we wanted to be sure to have a placeholder for this subject. So that really is a quick overview of the topics and how we're planning on organizing them. We look forward to refining these more as we go forward. And Wes, I'm going to stop there and hand it back to you and Megan.
Thank you so much, Marta. Thank you, Jordan. If I still see him, looks like he may have had to fall off for a meeting. As always, your team does tremendous work, and I really appreciate the care taken in preparing these reports and the time today to share them with our community of practice. From my seat, thank you all very much for being here. It's always fun to see you all. I really appreciate the energy of this group, the participation from each of you, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.